The administrator smiled, a patient, practiced arrangement of the mouth that did not reach her eyes. She folded her hands on the polished surface of the conference table. The wood reflected the recessed lighting above, creating a sterile, depthless gleam. Beside her, a man in a dark suit, the pension fund's attorney, adjusted his tie. He had already said his piece. Now it was her turn to deliver the final word. The gentle but firm closing of the door. The room was quiet, conditioned air humming a single, monotonous note. The only other sound was the faint rustle of paper as she pushed a single sheet across the table. It was a summary of benefits, dense with codes and numbers, culminating in one stark figure at the bottom. $40.00. I'm afraid that's the final calculation, Mr. Mills. Her voice was calm, modulated, the kind of voice trained to deliver bad news without accepting responsibility for it. It was the voice of the system itself, impersonal and absolute. We've run the numbers 3 times. The merger in 1997 consolidated the legacy plans. Your service years were recalibrated according to the new vesting schedule. It's all quite standard. The man across the table did not look at the paper. His name was Frank Mills. He was 68 years old, with hands that looked like they had spent 40 of those years holding steel, not paper. They were clean but mapped with fine, pale scars and the permanent grain of hard work. He wore a flannel shirt, buttoned to the collar, and work boots that were scuffed but not dirty. His coat was folded neatly on the empty chair beside him. He looked at the administrator, then at the lawyer, his gaze steady and unblinking. He hadn't spoken in 10 minutes. He let them fill the silence, watching as their confidence swelled to fill the space his own words left empty. They saw an old man, confused by the numbers, clinging to a past that no longer existed on their spreadsheets. A man they needed to manage with courtesy before showing him the door. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't recount his years of service or speak of promises made. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his coat. His movements were slow, deliberate. The administrator's smile tightened slightly at the corners. She expected a letter from a congressman, perhaps, a printout from a website, something easily dismissed. The lawyer subtly checked his watch. This was the last appointment of his day. Frank Mills placed a small object on the table. It landed with a soft, solid weight that seemed to absorb the room's artificial light. It was not a file folder or a sheaf of papers. It was a small leather book, no bigger than a man's palm. The dark brown leather was worn smooth at the edges, cracked along the spine. The cover was bare, except for a faint, embossed Union crest, its details nearly erased by time and pressure. It was a Union dues book from 1969. He opened it to the first page. Then he slid it across the polished table. No words, no hesitation. The book came to a stop directly in front of the administrator's folded hands. The silence that followed was different. The hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade. The lawyer, who had been looking toward the window, turned his head slowly back to the table. The administrator did not move. She just stared at the open book and the faded ink inside. The room was on the 12th floor of a glass tower that had been built on land where a foundry used to stand. Frank Mills knew this because he remembered the foundry. He remembered the smell of coal smoke and hot metal that used to drift across the river on humid summer nights. Now the air just smelled like traffic and rain on pavement. The conference room had one wall of tinted glass, offering a panoramic view of a city that had systematically erased most of its own history. The table was long, built for 20, but there were only 3 people present. 4, if you counted the man Frank had brought with him, his son-in-law, who sat quietly by the door and said nothing, a silent witness. Miss Davies, the administrator, finally looked up from the small book. A professional calm was a shield, and it remained firmly in place. "Mr. Mills," she began, "I appreciate you bringing this in, but as Mr. Adler explained, historical documents, while important to you personally, don't alter the fund's legal obligations under the current plan agreement. The 1997 merger was a comprehensive restructuring. It superseded all prior agreements." Her tone was patient, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. Mr. Adler, the lawyer, leaned forward. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, a gesture of casual authority. He picked up the book, holding it by the edges as if it were a fragile artifact, which it was. Frank, he said, using his first name in an attempt to build a rapport that wasn't there. I was with the fund's counsel during the merger. I personally reviewed the transition clauses for the legacy plans. The goal was to standardize, to create a single, equitable system for everyone. Some older, informal agreements were inevitably made redundant. It was a necessary step to ensure the fund's long-term solvency. He was not arguing a point, he was stating a fact. He placed the book back on the table, closed. A closed case. Frank Mills watched them. He saw the confidence in their posture, the certainty in their language. They had their documents. They had their data. They had the weight of $1 billion institution behind them. They had a story they had told themselves and others so many times that it had become the only truth they could see. A story of systems, of solvency, of necessity. A story that had a neat, clean column for his 40 years of labour and an equally neat, clean number at the bottom, $40. His own story was not so neat. It was held together by memory, by promises spoken in loud union halls, by the feel of a worn leather book that had lived in a drawer for half a century. The stakes were simple. The number on the paper was not a clerical error. It was an erasure. It was the conversion of a life's work into an insult. The pension was supposed to be $1,854 a month. It was the amount he and his wife Eleanor had planned their lives around. It was the foundation upon which their modest, careful retirement was built. It was mortgage payments and property taxes and the ability to fix the roof without going into debt. It was the quiet dignity of not having to ask for help. $40 was not dignity. It was a termination, a final invoice for a life already spent. Frank looked at the two faces across from him. They didn't see any of that. They saw a line item, a legacy issue to be managed. He knew then that he would not be able to explain it to them. He would have to show them. 3 weeks earlier, the letter had arrived. It was a simple white envelope, like all the others from the fund. Frank had been in his workshop in the basement, carefully cleaning a set of antique wood chisels. The smell of honing oil and old wood filled the small space. He went upstairs to the kitchen, washed his hands at the sink, and opened the envelope with his thumb. He read the letter twice. He felt no surge of anger, no panic. What he felt was a deep, cold stillness, the feeling of a gear slipping in a machine he had trusted for decades. He folded the letter, placed it on the kitchen counter next to the ceramic bowl where Eleanor had always kept the mail. The bowl was empty now, most days. He made a cup of coffee. He sat at the kitchen table, the one his father had built from oak harvested off their own land 60 years ago. He looked out the window at the bird feeder. A cardinal landed, a flash of impossible red against the grey afternoon. He didn't think about the money. He thought about the promise. He thought about a meeting in 1969 in the smoky auditorium of the Union Hall. The company was being sold. Men were nervous. The new owners, a conglomerate from out of state, had sent a man in a suit to reassure them. The union president, a man named Joe Riley, had stood on the stage and hammered out the deal. Pensions would be protected, ironclad he'd called it, guaranteed. A new dues book was issued that year to every man on the floor, a symbol of that new guarantee. After his coffee, Frank went down to the basement, not to the workshop, but to a small, dry storage room under the stairs. Against the far wall was a grey metal footlocker, his father's. It hadn't been opened in 20 years. He knelt, the concrete cold against his knees, and undid the latches. The hinges groaned. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and cedar. It was an archive of a working life, his father's, and then his. pay stubs bundled with twine, old tax returns, safety manuals, and in a small wooden box, a collection of union dues books, one for every few years of service. He found his father's first from 1946, then his own. He carefully lifted them out one by one, feeling the years in their worn covers. 1957, 1962, 1965. And then, at the bottom, the one from 1969. It was different from the others. The leather was a darker brown. The Union crest was a newer design. He took it back upstairs to the kitchen table. The light was fading. He turned on the lamp, the one with the green glass shade. He opened the book. The first few pages were stamps, one for each month he'd paid his dues. He ran his thumb over them. January, February, March. 40 years of stamps, in this book and others. On the inside front cover, tucked into a small leather flap, was his union card, laminated in thick yellowed plastic. His picture was on it, a young man with dark hair and a serious expression, staring out from 1969. He slid the card out. He turned it over, and there on the back was what he was looking for, a signature in faded blue ink. Beneath it, a line of type he had forgotten until this very moment. It was a promise, memorialized, a promise the computer had never been told about. He sat there for a long time, the card in his hand, the quiet house settling around him. He knew what he had to do. It would not be a fight, it would be a correction. A single heavy gear being eased back into its proper place. The pension was not an abstract number. It was Eleanor's garden. She had spent the last 10 years of her life planning it, planting it, tending it. It was her piece. After she was gone, Frank had kept it up. He learned the names of the flowers he'd never known, peonies, delphiniums. He learned which ones needed sun and which preferred shade. The pension was the water bill for that garden. It was the bags of mulch in the spring. It was the quiet hours he spent there feeling closer to her than anywhere else. They had been married for 44 years. They had built their life on a simple understanding. You work hard, you keep your word, and you honor your agreements. The company had promised. The union had promised. And for 40 years he had held up his end of the bargain. He went to work every day. He did not complain. He did his job, and he did it well. He remembered a conversation one night, years ago, sitting on the porch swing. They were looking at brochures for a trip they wanted to take, a train across the country. "We'll do it when we're both retired," she'd said, "when the pension comes in. We'll have all the time in the world." They never took that trip. Her illness came on too fast. But the promise of that time, the security it represented, was a comfort. It was the knowledge that their work had built something solid, something that would last. That pension was the last piece of the life they had built together. It was a testament to their shared history. To see it dismissed by a computer algorithm and a man in a suit who used his first name without familiarity was not just a financial problem. It was a violation. It was a statement that their history did not matter, that the promises made to them were subject to revision by people who had never set foot on the factory floor, who had never known the smell of cutting oil or the weight of a 12-hour shift. Some men collect problems. Frank Mills collected patience. He had learned it from machines. He knew that you could not force a piece of metal into place. You had to understand it. You had to find the right alignment, apply steady pressure, and wait for it to settle. You could not rush it. You could not get angry with it. You simply had to do the work, correctly and in the right order. This meeting was no different. He was not there to fight. He was there to align the parts. The parts were the truth, the promise, and the paperwork. The institution was the misaligned gear. He was the patient mechanic with the one tool they didn't know existed. He owed it to Eleanor. He owed it to his father, who had worked at the same plant before him. He owed it to the young man in the union card photograph, the one who had believed in the handshake and the signature on the back of a card. Some things are planted for the next man. This was a debt planted for his older self, and he was here to see it paid. Back in the conference room, the air was thick with professional patience. The lawyer, Mr. Adler, reopened the small dues book. He was looking for a flaw, a loophole, a way to dismiss it. He slid his finger down the page. "This is a standard dues ledger, Mr. Mills." He said it softly. "We have copies of these in the archives. They don't confer special status." Frank leaned forward just enough to be seen. He didn't point. He didn't need to. He just spoke. "Page 4, the stamp." Adler turned the fragile page. At the top of page 4, above the neat rows of monthly due stamps for 1970, was another stamp. It was circular, applied in purple ink that had faded to a soft lavender. Inside the circle were the words Plan A, vested, and in the centre a number, 12. The administrator, Miss Davies, leaned over to look. "What is that?" she asked, her curiosity momentarily overriding her professional detachment. "That's the Article 12 provision," Frank said. His voice was flat, a simple statement of fact. It guaranteed the 1969 benefit calculation for life, independent of any future plan changes. It was for the men who stayed on through the acquisition. Adler shook his head, a small, dismissive gesture. "I know Article 12. It was a limited clause. It applied only to a specific cohort of workers who accepted the early retirement buyout in 1982. Our records are very clear on that. You continued your service until 2007. Therefore, it doesn't apply to you." He closed the book again, the second closing of the case. He looked at Frank with a hint of pity. The old man was confused, misremembering details from decades ago. It was sad, but it didn't change the facts on the screen of his laptop. Frank said nothing for a moment. He let the lawyer's certainty settle in the room. Then he spoke again, his voice just as quiet, just as calm. "Turn the page." Adler's jaw tightened. This was becoming tedious. He opened the book again, his movements now sharp, impatient. He turned to the next page. It was a ledger page with handwritten notes in the margins. It detailed a few specific contributions, special assessments for a strike fund. Frank directed him again. The entry for October 1982. Adler found the date. Next to it was a notation in neat cursive script. Early retirement option, declined. Continuation of service per clause 12B. Beside the entry was a signature. Frank recognized it instantly. It was the signature of his union steward, a man named Mac Maloney, who had died 15 years ago. The lawyer stared at the handwriting. Clause 12B? I've never heard of a Clause 12B. The merger documents only reference Article 12. It was an addendum, Frank said, for the handful of senior men the new company asked to stay on to train the younger crews. They let us keep the original guarantee as an incentive. It was all handled by the union local, on paper. It was never entered into the main company system. They didn't have computers for that back then. It was all paper. And this is the paper. A pause. The room went quiet. The first true crack had appeared in the institution's wall of certainty. The lawyer was looking at a document he had never seen, referencing a clause he did not know. Miss Davies shifted in her chair. A polished composure was beginning to show a faint tarnish of unease. She looked from the book to Frank, her eyes reassessing the man in front of her. He was no longer just a confused old worker. He was a man who had brought a map of a territory she didn't know existed. She decided to take a different approach, a softer one. "Frank," she said, her voice dropping a little, becoming more personal, "I understand. I truly do. The systems we have now, they aren't perfect. They can miss things.
But the fund has a fiduciary duty to all its members. We can't make an exception based on a handwritten note in an old booklet. The integrity of the entire system depends on applying the rules consistently. She was appealing to his sense of fairness, of the greater good. It was a practiced, effective tactic. It usually worked. Frank listened. He nodded slowly as she spoke, as if considering her point. When she was finished, he reached for the dues book.
He slid the laminated card out from its sleeve on the inside cover.
He did not look at his own young face. He turned it over and placed it on the table in the space between them. The back of the card was mostly blank, save for a few lines of fine print at the bottom, and in the middle, written in the same faded blue ink as the signature, were two things. The first was the signature of the company president at the time, a man named Arthur Coleman. The second, written just below it, was a single unambiguous sentence. This cardholder's Plan A, Article 12 guarantee is permanent and non-revocable. The lawyer, Adler, leaned forward without touching it, peering at the writing. His breath made a small momentary fog on the old plastic. He read the sentence. Then he read it again. The administrator read it over his shoulder. Done. That ended it. The argument was over.
The system had just collided with a fact it could not process,
A fact on a piece of 50-year-old plastic that carried more weight than all the data on their servers. The lawyer, Mr. Adler, sat back in his chair. He looked not at Frank, but at the wall of tinted glass, at the city beyond. He was a man who lived in a world of digital files, of searchable documents and contractual clauses that could be cross-referenced in seconds. He was now faced with a physical object whose authority was absolute and whose existence was entirely outside his structured world. He was a cartographer whose map had just been proven wrong by the discovery of a mountain. He took a slow breath. He turned to Miss Davies. His voice was low, stripped of its earlier confidence. We should verify this. Miss Davies nodded, grateful for the procedural lifeline. Of course. She looked at Frank. Mr. Mills, would you object if we tried to contact someone from the union's historical committee?
just to confirm the authenticity of this type of endorsement.
I wouldn't object, Frank said. The next 20 minutes were a study in quiet institutional panic. Miss Davies made a series of calls on her desk phone, a voice, a polite murmur. She was transferred twice. She was put on hold. Muzak trickled faintly from the speaker. Frank sat perfectly still. He did not drink the water they had offered him. He did not check his phone. He waited. He had been waiting for this moment for 3 weeks. He could wait 20 more minutes. Finally, a voice came on the line. It was an old voice, gravelly and thick with the sound of a life spent talking over the noise of machinery. Sal, this is Carol Davies from the Pension Fund Administration. I'm sorry to bother you. I was told you might be able to help us with a question about a pre-merger plan. Silence on the other end. Then the voice spoke. I'm listening. Miss Davies described the dues book, the purple stamp, the handwritten note.
Finally, she described the union card, the signature of Arthur Coleman, and the sentence written on the back. She read it aloud, word for word. This cardholder's Plan A, Article 12 guarantee is permanent and non-revocable. When she finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. The silence stretched. 1 second. 5. 10. In the conference room, no one moved. They were all waiting for the verdict from a man they had never met, a voice from the past. Finally, Sal spoke. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room. A Coleman card, he said, more to himself than to them. My God, I haven't heard of one of those turning up in 30 years. Arthur Coleman signed maybe 50 of them himself back in '69. It was a personal guarantee. His word. The union insisted on it for the senior foreman they needed to keep the plant running. That card is Tier 1. It's ironclad. It exists outside the 97 merger. It exists outside everything. You find the man who holds that card. You pay him what it says. There's no argument. There's no discussion. It's a ghost. A ghost from the old world. And you have to treat it with respect. Another pause. Sal spoke again. Is the man who holds the card there with you? Yes, Miss Davies said, her voice barely a whisper. He is. Then you tell him Sal DeFranco says hello. And you tell him I'm sorry you people made him come all the way down there to prove who he is. The line went dead. The spell was broken. The institutional certainty had vanished, replaced by a nervous, hurried deference. Miss Davies looked at Frank, her expression a mixture of awe and professional chagrin. Mr. Mills, she began, we deeply apologise. Clearly there has been a significant oversight, an error in our records that goes back decades. We will rectify it immediately. She was already typing on her laptop, her fingers moving quickly. The lawyer, Adler, cleared his throat. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. He was a negotiator again, trying to regain control. Frank, he said, the fund would like to offer you a settlement to compensate for this error. We can restore your full pension, of course, retroactive to the first incorrect payment, and in addition, we'd like to offer a lump sum payment of $10,000 for the distress this has caused you. He smiled, a conciliatory, problem-solving smile. Frank looked at the lawyer. He saw the offer for what it was. It was not an apology. It was a transaction. It was hush money, meant to close the file and ensure his silence. It was an attempt to turn a matter of principle into a matter of commerce. He thought of Eleanor's garden. He thought of the promise made in the Union Hall. He thought of the quiet dignity he was here to reclaim. None of those things had a price. He shook his head, a single, slight motion. I don't want your $10,000. He spoke slowly, making sure they understood. I just want the check to be what it's supposed to be, and I want a letter of correction for my file. That's all. Adler was taken aback. He had never had a client turn down free money. But, Mr. Mills, you're entitled to it. The fund made a mistake. It was a mistake. Frank agreed. Now, it's being fixed. The money doesn't change that, it just makes it messy. I want it clean. Just the pension, the amount we agreed on in 1969. Miss Davies stopped typing. She looked at Frank, and for the first time, she seemed to see the man, not the case file. She saw the simple, unbreakable integrity he possessed. It was a quality her spreadsheets and actuarial tables could never measure. She nodded, a small gesture of respect. Of course, Mr. Mills, whatever you wish. She returned to her keyboard. The quiet clicking of the keys was the only sound. The lawyer sat back, silent, his role in this conversation now over. He had offered the only solution he knew, and it had been refused. He was out of tools. Frank waited patiently. He watched the light change outside the window as the afternoon began to fade. He felt no sense of victory, no triumph. He felt only a quiet satisfaction, the feeling of a job done right, a piece of machinery humming back to life, the gears meshing perfectly, just as they were designed to do. It's done. Miss Davis's voice was soft. Your pension has been restored to the correct amount. The retroactive payments will be deposited in your account within 48 hours. A formal letter of correction and apology will be sent to your home address. She closed her laptop. The meeting was over. Frank Mills nodded once. He reached across the table and retrieved his union card, the plastic warm from sitting in the light. He slid it carefully back into its sleeve inside the old dues book. He closed the book and held it in his hand for a moment before placing it back in the inside pocket of his coat. He stood up. His son-in-law stood with him. Frank put on his coat, buttoning it slowly. He looked at the administrator and the lawyer. He did not say thank you. They had done nothing for him. They had merely stopped doing something wrong.
He did not say goodbye. He simply turned and walked toward the door. His work boots made no sound on the thick gray carpet. He walked out of the sterile conference room, out of the glass tower, and back into the world he had helped to build. A world of promises kept and debts paid. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving two people in a silent room with the ghost of a 50-year-old handshake. That evening, Frank sat not in the kitchen, but on the back steps, looking out over Eleanor's garden. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. The air was cool and carried the scent of damp earth.
He took the small leather book from his coat pocket. He didn't open it. He just held it in his hand, the worn leather familiar against his palm. He thought of the young man in the photograph inside, the one with the serious eyes. That young man had trusted the words of others. He had accepted a promise and then had gone to work for 40 years believing it would be honored. He had done his part, and today the old man had made sure the other side did theirs. A promise was like a seed. You plant it in the ground of a specific moment, but it is meant to grow into the future. Some you plant for yourself, some for your children, and some you plant simply because it is the right thing to do. A small act of faith in a world that often rewards the faithless. The pension was never just about the money. It was about that seed.
It was proof that a promise could survive decades, could outlast the men who made it, could withstand mergers and computer systems and the confident dismissals of a new generation. It was proof that something true, if cared for, could endure. Some men collect grievances, letting them grow into a bitter harvest. He collected patience. He had kept the proof. If a story about a quiet promise held for 50 years stayed with you, there is more to share. Next time, we meet a librarian from Ohio who bought a desk at a government auction. She wasn't looking for anything special, just a place to do her work. But inside a locked drawer she thought was empty, she found a single forgotten key. It was a key that opened a lock nobody in her small town knew still existed, and revealed a secret that had been buried on purpose for 70 years. Stay with us.